Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Lots goes on in Ottawa in the summertime, as says Blacklocks, which is an online publishing entity that goes and gets documents from a lot of the different committees and other things in Parliament, and wants to make sure that we're aware of what's going on. And the publisher of Blacklocks, Doan, is with us tonight, and she posted really quite an interesting review of all the different things that were happening in all the different committees that maybe because we all take vacation and maybe people in Ottawa think we take vacation may be missing. Doan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So tell us, you posted this, why? To just make us aware that summertime doesn't, the business of government doesn't stop, or to warn us, or to show us the depth of all the information that Blacklocks uncovers?
I was listening to another media podcast and they were talking about how it was a slow week in Ottawa. They didn't really have much to talk about, and I don't understand that. We live in one of the most information-rich places in the country. Our federal government is continuously pumping out an endless conveyor belt of reports and supplementary estimates and responses to inquiries of ministry. Now, it's true that in the middle of June, our members of Parliament, all with much relief, shut briefcases and run back to go to rodeos and country fairs. But that's exactly the time the government, the administrative end of government, starts to post, for instance, regulations, which you may know are the real meat of legislation.
And so tell us what Blacklocks is. Blacklocks goes through a lot of these regulations and a lot of the committees, and you publish and report on a lot of this more detailed information, not just the horse race that a lot of the regular media reports on, correct?
Well, in fact, we don't do the horse race at all. If we did the horse race, Brian, who would buy it? If everybody's going to tell you tomorrow about the cabinet shuffle, why would you pay to read about the cabinet shuffle on Blacklocks? So we are forced by circumstances to provide a conveyor belt of quote unquote scoops every day. So what do? Well, we're document journalists, which means that over the 11 years or so we've been in business, we have taught ourselves how to look through government online materials for information. The government there was always documents posted that were supplementary to say the budget or to legislation. But in the olden times, you had to go down to the Library of Parliament and wait for the little lady in the library sweater to come pushing the trolley down the corridor and the rotunda to bring these documents. Now they are mandated by statute that they're all posted online. So what we've done over the 11 years or so is taught ourselves where to find those documents. And sometimes, I don't want to shock you, Brian, but sometimes they kind of hide them a little bit.
They kind of hide them in some esoteric little website for some department.
They'll deposit them in an offshoot of the website to an offshoot to an offshoot, and they'll deposit under an odd file, the wrong year or something, right?
So the regulation is that they have to be posted online, but not that they have to be posted online and easily accessible by the public.
Look, you paid for this information. It's public information. So if, let's say, the Department of Industry does an audit. And I should say that the former Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, introduced a system of audits that we know of as lessons learned. What's that? That's where whenever they announce a program, let's say they announce a green tech program, then they must do an audit, an internal audit, to find out if it worked, if it was effective, which makes sense, right? So here's an example. You might recall about 6 years ago, the Department of Industry under then Minister Navdeep Bains announced the innovation superclusters that were going to create 56,000 jobs. Now, there are 3,000 communications staff in Ottawa that are going to be glad to tell you the good news of the 56,000 jobs created by innovation superclusters, and media will cover it. And then they never return, they never revisit. So if you remember that story, let's take a look at it. What the Department of Industry said about 3 weeks ago in a briefing note to the Senate was that about 60% of that money, the money was gone, but the 60% of the money was non-recoverable, and that 31% of all the projects had gone to Quebec. that didn't create, as Blacklocks reported earlier through access to information, it did not create 56,000 jobs, but maybe around 7.
What?
So,
7?
Yeah.
7 jobs. 7 whole jobs.
7,000. 7,000.
Oh, God. Well, that's still
So
bad.
don't you think that's valuable follow-up for
Yes.
the money that you spent on the innovation project?
Yes.
So I guess if you can get past the cabinet shuffle and teach yourself where to find these documents, let me give you another one example from Blacklocks today. So there was in supplementary estimates. Supplementary estimates, by the way, are the details on the budget. So whenever a government announces a budget in, say, March or April, it's kind of like a propaganda document, because there's lots of attention to it, and all the reporters go to the lockup, right? And it's embargoed, and they read the budget, and they talk to the finance department to explain it. But the fact is, the true numbers that flesh out what the spending is in the budget come out in dribs and drabs in supplementary estimates. So supplementary estimates this week from Health Canada tell us that an additional $17.5 million of a budget that started in 2022 and runs through 2026 is allocated to the maintenance of the structure for vaccine passports. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. You thought the pandemic was declared.
I thought COVID was over.
Yeah, we thought it was too. But there is this money in place, which is not an insignificant amount of money, to have as a public health tool, to be of use to public health, was the way they described it. Now, they're not going to say that in the budget, because that might alarm some people that the government wants to lock us down and have us show our vax passport forever, which, maybe isn't inaccurate. But anyway, this is a public health tool, they say. So isn't that a story?
That is a story. So lots of stories that you uncover in the documents that get published online, sometimes not terribly easily accessible.
Here's
in the
another
summertime.
one.
No,
Here's
well, we're
another
gonna come back. We're gonna come back
Sure.
and go through some
Okay.
of these in detail in just a minute. We're chatting tonight with Holly Doan, who is the publisher of Blacklocks. Holly, if people want to check it out, what website can they go to see what your articles are?
Blacklocks.ca. We're a paywall. You'll have to pay, but you'll see a nice little cut line roundup with all the juicy bits. So you get the vibe.
You get the juicy bits for free. If you want to get the whole
Very bit, a
the
very
whole
bit
piece of meat, you gotta pay for it.
That's
We're
right.
going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with Holly Doan, and we're going to talk about some of these issues, and a little bit more about Blacklocks, and a little bit more about why it is that so much of this comes out in the summertime when we're not paying attention, and or Friday afternoons when we're not paying attention, or some people think we're not. We're going to take a break. Back in 2. Stay with us, everybody. This is going to be an interesting conversation tonight. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Holly Doan, who is the publisher of Blacklocks Reporter, which is an online publisher of documentary stuff that the federal government publishes online in lots of areas that Holly says are not sometimes terribly publicly easily accessible. What intrigued me and got me to reach out to Holly was a post that she made titled "Never Take Your Eyes Off Ottawa in the Summer." Never take your eyes off Ottawa in the summer. And she talks about a couple of different things. The Privy Council polls LGBTQ community on pulling government funding for any person, group, or company unaccepting of LGBTQ individuals. Number 2, reporters may conceal conflicts of interest involving analysts that quote in stories under ruling by National Press Ombudsman. Number 3, Department of Safety memo warnings of pro-China propaganda that may pollute the general media. Number 4, Health Canada budgets $17.6 million to support vaccine passports going forward until 2026. Number 5, Health Canada cites rise in pediatric cannabis poisoning since marijuana legalized in 2018. Holly, each one of these are interesting stories.
Somebody said to me once that the stories you do, we're in a very tumultuous time in media. Maybe we can talk about that later. But somebody once said to me that once upon a time, it was a television assignment editor said at one of the networks that, back in the day, in olden times, every single one of these stories could have been a front page story. Unfortunately, media doesn't really focus on some of the fine details of how we're governed, let's put it that way. But that's okay. Maybe that's why we're going to have niche in the future moving forward, like us.
Exactly. So can we talk about some of these? And you may not be, you're the publisher, you're not the editor or the story writer of each one of these, but you may not be familiar with them all. But this Privy Council polls LGBT community on pulling government funding for any person, group, or company that's unaccepting of LGBTQ individuals.
Right. All right. So that at Blacklocks, we don't cover polls. We're not interested in the polls that are released by Nanos or Ipsos or Abacus, the public opinion polls. Those are a staple of mainstream media, as you know. They are public opinion polls, and perhaps they're interesting. Some people call them a kind of a horse race if they're polling on politics and not really of any use, particularly, yep, 2 years out from an election, say, if that's the subject. But there are more interesting polls going on within our government. The Privy Council is the administrative arm for Cabinet and for the Prime Minister's office. Think of it as the executive branch. So why do they poll? They poll based on Cabinet's instructions to follow up on legislation or programs that have been introduced to see how Canadians are responding. Are they favorable? Are they cooperative? Are they willing to comply, depending on... And then another thing that makes the Privy Council polls even more interesting is that quite often the government will poll on something before it intends to do it. So this, to us, is more of a news story than the horse race public opinion polls, because it tells us what our government is working on and what's coming.
And maybe thinking about doing.
Right, what you're going to see in legislation, what you're going to see in the election campaign. So before we get to the LGBTQ, let me give you another example. I think it was May of 2020, at the start of the pandemic, the Prime Minister said outside Rideau Cottage that he felt vaccine mandates were divisive and he wouldn't want to do that, right? In March of 2021, the Privy Council polled on vaccine mandates. And it was called a psychographic poll. And some of the things were asking people how they would respond. And I'm not quoting the exact language, this is 2 years ago, asking people how they felt about the unvaccinated. And they found that some were angry if, say, their neighbor wouldn't be vaccinated, that they were putting all of us at risk. Then the election was called in September of 2021. And if you recall, the first thing the governing party announced as part of its campaign was vaccine mandates. Why? First, it's divisive. Now we're polling on it. We find Canadians are upset, and now they're going to campaign on it. And some critics call that the vaccine mandate election, because that was an issue that would excite the base, excite the population.
And one that was very different between maybe not all the Conservative Party, but certainly some of the Conservative Party.
Right. And they could maybe blame Conservatives for not liking vaccine that's a thing. That's a partisan thing. So let's fast forward now to this past March and the story that you cited that we had today. And that is they are now polling, asking Canadians whether they think that different individuals, groups, companies ought to be sanctioned by being denied any kind of funding, grants, loans, if they are not, quote, accepting of LGBTQ individuals. And they postulated that maybe there should be some kind of, say, grant program or scholarship program for LGBTQ. What do you think of that? So you could suggest that now our government is considered, this is going to be, I say to you, Brian, watch for this issue. Watch for this issue in announcements and campaigns and statements coming up in the months ahead.
Now, it's interesting. What you've just described is that they polled the Canadian community. What your headline says is they only polled the LGBTQ community.
Yes. I should have made that clear. So they asked for preferences, and then that's who they polled. Because, of course, if that issue resonated, then that might be very useful to campaign on in, say, population dense areas of Toronto or Vancouver.
And how do you get like this poll is actually published, or is it just the fact that they paid for a poll published and you get sort of summary data? Do you get all the data from the poll?
Yes, most of their focus groups. So you even get comments from the people in the focus groups. If they didn't like something or they like something, like they'll spit that opinion out, and that's sometimes included in the summaries. So now, remember I said before that looking for government information online it's a little bit like a needle in a haystack.
Yeah.
So those, for example, the Privy Council opinion polls, they must put those online. You paid for them. It's public data. Those are an example of, it's called continuous qualitative views of Canadians or something like that. And they're constantly polling under that. But the results are not always deposited promptly or conveniently in the place that they should be. Sometimes you have to search. Why? I'll let you speculate.
That's fascinating. And wasn't there a similar policy at one point in time in regards to funding of organizations that were either supportive of or unsupportive of abortion?
Yes, it was Catholic. Remember, there were Catholic organizations that actually fought this, that went to court because they were cut off of their funding because of abortion.
That would suggest that there sort of has been a practice of this kind of policy in the past, at least on one issue. So it makes sense that it might be applicable to another issue.
It does. The difference now in these times we live in is that these issues are sometimes, not always, sometimes evolve into what that term you've heard, wedge issues.
Well, not sometimes, lots of times, no question.
I'm being careful.
No, I think
issue...
this is interesting because I can see exactly where the conservative leader and the conservative base would have an extremely different, if not frankly, the opposite point of view on this topic than the Liberals might.
Right. And, so that would be useful in a campaign.
And it would be interesting to know not only what people within the LGBT community feel about this issue and, the broader community as a whole. And so it'd be interesting to know if they actually polled wider than just the LGBT community.
They may. So you might ask, why are they polling with this community only? Why not? They may still. Someone else suggested that, and I'm sure that the opposition leader's office is thinking about this right now as we speak, reading that story. They're thinking, well, what are Muslim communities going to think about that? How's that going to play with them?
Unaccepting of LGBTQ individuals. That's interesting. So it's, one would think if an organization is unaccepting of LGBTQ individuals, they would be guilty of human rights violations, wouldn't they?
But there's no real definition of what unaccepting means. What does that mean? So, I mean, if a Catholic organization, to use your example, was unaccepting of abortion, does that's up to them if they want to have those teachings within their organizations. Doesn't mean anything for the law, but that's why I suggest. Some have said that maybe this is a constitutional issue and that it's actually discriminating against people who have those views, who don't accept LGBTQ, like Muslims. That's their religious view.
That's sort of what happened in the United States with the Supreme Court finding in the United States that someone could actually turn down baking a cake for a gay couple. That was just came out just a week or two ago. That's interesting. That's fascinating.
These are buttons. One time years ago, I interviewed former Prime Minister Kim Campbell for a documentary series I was doing. And I was asking her about the 93 election and how she got wiped out and all these issues that people who had been so mad about because they were mad at Brian Mulroney. She said something that I've never forgotten. She said, we have a lot of buttons in Canada. Don't push those buttons. If you want to keep everybody happy and together, don't push those buttons, which made a lot of sense to all of us because Mulroney, I guess she was saying, had pushed buttons. Now we live in an era where you push the buttons and that's how you get elected.
This, and I know you're not a reporter or a columnist, so you don't express opinions, but I will. I think that this protest in Belleville that was so much in the news, where people were hurling incredible insults at the Prime Minister. I think is symptomatic of exactly that issue, that we push buttons so hard that people become extremist. And I think what they did is wrong. But I got into a big argument with someone just this weekend about, part of the problem is that it's sort of it's the Hillary Clinton calling people deplorable, and the prime minister not agreeing to even meet with and listen to the trucker convoy people. And so when you don't listen to people and you diminish almost their right to have an opinion, and you say their opinion is extremist, and frankly, some of their opinions are extremist, but when you don't even listen to people, you force them to become extremist, and you force them to yell. And it's the old line about when you don't listen to people, they may yell.
But Terry Glavin out in BC had an excellent column yesterday. I urge anybody to read and subscribe, where he said, if you think that this government should be trying to calm that anger and put a lid on this division, like, you'd be wrong. They like it. It works.
Yeah.
Don't forget, there was a howling mob, and I don't agree with them. I don't think that's the way to do it. There was a howling mob, and the prime minister walked right into it. And there weren't
Lily in the Toronto Sun.
There were only pool cameras, right?
Lily in the Toronto Sun, who, the Toronto Sun, not known for its left-wing views, stated that he thought that the protesters would actually would result in the opposite of what they were hoping for, because this would motivate the liberal base to come out more than it would actually upset Trudeau. That's interesting.
And
That's
this is the divisive politics we were talking about.
And so what you're saying is subscribe to Blacklocks, and you'll understand some of the polls that the Privy Council are doing and what the government might be thinking about in the future. And if you don't, you might miss the coming Wedge issue. Fascinating. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with Holly Doan of Blacklocks and understand a couple of more of these issues, which is kind of interesting. It's almost like getting a secret look at some of the things the government is thinking about. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Our topic tonight is Blacklocks, an online publishing entity that publishes a whole bunch of documentary things that the government releases that a lot of us may not know about and pay attention to, and they talk about. And we've talked about one, which is a poll that the Privy Council did on LGBTQ issues. Holly Doan, the publisher of Blacklocks, wrote a post saying, never take your eyes off Ottawa in the summer, because a lot of these things that get posted in the summer, and she went through a whole bunch of these. Holly, before I go back to some of these issues, I got to ask you, you've got a fascinating background. So you're the publisher right now, and have been for the last 10 years, of Blacklocks Reporter, which is this organization that we mentioned that is a daily online digest of Canadian government news and analysis that's providing information needed by business, labor, and associates that specializes in access to information, bills and regulations, committees and debates, sector news, and federal court rulings. Fascinating. But before that, for 14 years, you were a documentary producer with CPAC. And before that, for 7 years, you were the Beijing bureau chief in Ottawa and Toronto. So you probably have some interesting views on all of this China stuff that we've been talking about lately. And before that, you, for 5 years, were a reporter for CBC in the Alberta legislature. So a really fascinating background that you've brought to your position as publisher of Blacklocks. Let's go to some of the other issues. I really find this next one very interesting. Reporters may conceal conflicts of interest involving analysts they quote in stories under a ruling by the National Press Ombudsman. So this is interesting. I would have thought if an analyst has a conflict of interest, they would have to, like, it's only ethical that they present that conflict of interest. I read every day in the newspaper, blah blah blah. That's a parent part of the parent corporation of this newspaper, or CNN owned by blah blah blah. So people publish conflicts of interest on a regular basis. Why would a reporter not have to do that?
Well, I guess you'd have to ask the reporter in question at the National Post, but the story you're talking about, just to give your viewers and listeners a little bit of background, is that there was a trial in June. Blacklocks was the plaintiff, and the defendant is the government of Canada. The government of Canada for 10 years has been a defendant in 14 lawsuits where we're suing them because they bought single passwords online and then distributed those passwords multiple times to other individuals, other departments, and then cut and paste and shotgunned our copy through the public service without payment, permission, or license. So we have been fighting for 10 years to protect paywalls. The story. So it was a fairly, copyright is dense. It was a really dense 3-day trial. And this reporter did not cover the trial, nor did she read the affidavits or the motion record, which ran to thousands and thousands and thousands of pages. She consulted with a lawyer on Twitter who had a solicitor-client relationship with the Justice Department. In other words, with the defendant. He had provided them advice on opposing Blacklocks. And so that's a no-no to cite a person like this as an expert who has actively acted against Blacklocks basically in cahoots with the opposing legal team. He was not identified online as an advocate or a lobbyist or in a solicitor-client relationship, according to the Justice Department. He was only identified as a retired copyright lawyer. So now you as a reader would think that she can do what she likes, but she probably should cite that he had been in a solicitor-client relationship with the Justice Department. She did contact us asking our lawyer to speak, but we had some reservations because she had indicated that she had spoken to all the counsel involved when we knew she had not spoken to the government. So we filed a complaint with the Media Council. What's that? The Media Council is an organization that is set up. Most legacy media are members, most newspapers. It's designed to field complaints from the public and then investigate them where they feel need be. Why do we have a media council? Well, in a way, it's a litigation shield for the newspapers. So if you got a beef with, let's say, the Toronto Star, you would write to the media council, file your complaint, and they would say, Brian, we will investigate this, but you must agree not to sue them. And you'll say, okay, as long as you're going to investigate them. Now, remember, this organization really acts for the benefit of its members, of newspapers, but it's like a steam valve to let off frustration from the public who might want to complain about media. So in this case, we complained and we said the story she didn't cite that the person that had been her chief and only authority had a major conflict of interest. The Media Council, in defending its members, the newspapers, rejected the complaint and said, no, that's fine. That conflict was fine. So we thought, well, if that's the state of Canadian media, it's all right, doesn't bother us, doesn't cost us anything. But if that's the state of Canadian media, that's a story. Readers should know that when they read their newspaper, that the Media Council says that you don't have to cite conflicts held by the analysts that you're interviewing as experts. What do you think of that?
I think it's completely wrong. And you know, just this weekend, I can't remember when it was, came out that the Pierre Poilievre campaign paid for the legal fees of the person that was the person that came out saying that Patrick Brown had paid for her work on the Patrick Brown campaign. That was the reason why Patrick Brown was excluded from the Conservative leadership. And up until we knew this conflict, we didn't know this. And I think that the whole attitude toward this complaint it still may be completely valid, but the attitude toward it changes dramatically when you find out that Pierre Poilievre's campaign funded all the legal fees.
Funny, information will do that. Information will add to your understanding or change your mind or reaffirm your opinion, won't it? In the absence of information, we are a poorer society. Now, you might say, I would say, yeah, politicians do all sorts of things. Some of them are kind of sleazy, right? They do all sorts of things. But media must hold a sacred trust. It's all we have, Brian. Because in these days when people don't want to pay for media anymore, if they don't trust you, your business model's dead.
Amen. Let's talk about some of the other ones. Department of Safety memo warns of pro-China propaganda that may pollute the general media. Pro-China propaganda?
I am just quickly looking up that story because I didn't write that one, but that was a public safety memo. It was a briefing note. A briefing note, what's a briefing note? This is another source of Blacklocks information. A briefing note is something that is given to prepare the minister in case he has to speak about this or he's, say, asked in question period. He's prepared briefing notes with facts. So this briefing note had said that the public safety had warned that information could be disseminated by Canadians who may not be fully aware that it originates from a foreign principal or entity. The briefing note comes from March 3rd, and it was titled, by the way, Election Interference. So they are warning that unclear labeling on state-backed communications can produce public or media messaging, in other words, dupe the media into not understanding that this is Chinese state-sponsored information. Now, it doesn't go on to really cite or explain, but it does. It's a piece of the puzzle, which is the election interference story that we are missing because we have not had a public inquiry. But these little dribs and drabs that come out in these internal memos give us a broader picture of the extent of the China interference in Canada.
Well, and I presume because in your post you put it in quotes that the memo actually includes the words pollute the general media.
Yes.
The word pollute is a pretty powerful word. It doesn't say, may influence. It doesn't say maybe, incorrectly described, but it says pollute. Pollute would suggest it is polluting the media that we
polluting. It's dirtying the minds of some media.
That's a pretty bad description.
That's not our word. That's not our word. That was the department, public safety's words.
In a briefing note to the ministers.
Yes.
That are saying that China may be financing or putting forward propaganda that is going to give us a perception in the general media that is polluted, that is wrong.
Yes. They're disseminating some information that could pollute because, of course, China's trying to protect its own interests. So it's, I don't know. I can only speculate.
I suggest they're not trying to have influence just on elections, but they're trying to have influence on a lot more than just elections, on general public opinion toward China.
Sure. If they're trying to pollute media, they're trying to influence Canadians' hearts and minds so that I guess governments too are more amenable to China's overtures.
This next one, we already talked about the vaccine passports, but this next one, I read 3 newspapers a day. I'm a news junkie. I haven't heard this. Where did I miss it? Health Canada cites a rise in pediatric cannabis poisonings since marijuana was legalized in 2018.
Well,
pediatric cannabis poisonings, really?
Yeah, that's their words too. That means kids. That means kids showing up at the hospital. I can look up some numbers for you if I
not that they're stoned, but they're poisoned.
Well, but I think poison kind of means they may have eaten some gummies. It doesn't mean they're on death's doorstep, although maybe some kid did get very, very sick, but it means that they come to the hospital sick or high.
How big is a rise? Like a rise could be like a 1% increase. Any idea what a rise is?
What they said was that children in Alberta, British Columbia, and Ontario, the incidence of cannabis poisoning and subsequent hospital rates, was 7.5 times higher relative to the pre-legalization period.
7.5 times. And
yes, in other words,
and in absolute numbers, how many in a year? Any idea how many that is? Is that cited?
I'm trying to remember.
It sort of makes sense, but it certainly isn't one of the things that the government brags about when they brag about their legalization of marijuana.
Okay,
that's for sure.
Here we go. So from the period before legalization, there were about 46,000 emergencies at hospitals, all the time involving all sorts of things. That was alcohol was the most common, then cannabis. So what they're saying now is that cannabis is now the most frequent up there with alcohol, whereas before legalization, it wasn't.
And you said it's 7 times up from 46,000?
It was 7.5 times higher. So now why is that? I guess, I don't know, are gummies lying around the house now because they're so easy to get? Or can 12-year-olds get their hands on them in the schoolyard because there's older kids who've gotten them? That, you know, it is easier to get a hold of drugs now, right? To get a hold of marijuana. But you say, well, you read a lot of newspapers, you never saw that. Why do you think that is?
Because they're not paying attention to the documents that you are.
They're not paying attention to the documents. And also there might be a political point of view that if you support the legalization of marijuana, and
you don't want to publicize this result.
Well, you don't want to talk about the bad stuff. We want to talk about that as an achievement. Now, I make no comment whether I personally think that's an achievement or not. My opinion is irrelevant. In fact, I'm bored with my own opinions, quite frankly. I only really am interested in the facts that the government doesn't release in news releases. Those are the juiciest ones. The news releases are awful.
Just out of interest, does it define what pediatric is? Does it include teenagers or is it only kids?
No, that includes teenagers too. Yeah.
So I wonder if that's, you know, people picking up gummies that shouldn't, or people that are actually teenagers that are actually
getting hold of them and, you know, taking too many of them at a party. Yeah. Well, you know, we've reported this story before actually, but it seems to be a little bit more information coming in dribs and drabs. Hopefully we'll be able to see the full data sometime, but maybe it's even too early for them. It's only been a couple of years, right?
So I want to take a final break and come back. I'm going to ask you why you think that so much of this is released in the summer, is released on Friday afternoons, is released in these memos that and these briefing notes that never get publicized. You know, why is it that it's so difficult? It would appear to be so difficult to get the information from the people that are supposed to be working for us. We're going to take a break and come back in 2 minutes with Holly Doan of Blacklocks reporter. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Holly Doan. She is the publisher of Blacklocks Reporter. It's an online publisher of information that the government seems to not want us to know, because it puts it online in documents and briefing notes and other things that get posted online, but doesn't get press released about, doesn't get presented to the regular media. And it would appear the regular media, the mainline media, doesn't report on this, but Blacklocks does. And I was prompted to call up Holly because she posted a post on LinkedIn about that nothing stops in the summertime, and that you can't stop paying attention to what the government does in the summertime because lots happens in the summertime. Holly, do you think this is part of a strategy to hide things by publishing things in the summertime? And or you always hear that, if a big announcement comes out on a Friday afternoon, it's because the government doesn't want people to pay attention to it. Why is that? Are they trying to hide stuff from us?
Yeah, it's message control. When I first came to Ottawa the first time, when I worked in the CTV National News Bureau in the 90s, it was really much easier to get information. You could pick up the phone still in those days and talk to maybe a deputy minister, certainly a director. That's not the case anymore. Ottawa is ringed by communications staff. Nothing moves if it doesn't go through them. And their job is to produce positive messaging. That is all. And so it's much harder to get the kind of information in a casual way because of this battalion of comms guys, we call them, that prevent anything that's not positive to the government. At the same time, access to information has become terribly eroded in this country. I'm sure you've read about that. When Pierre Trudeau introduced access to information in 1982, we were the envy of the world. We were the first. It has gone nothing but downhill since, to where in the last presentation by the Information Commissioner before Parliament, she said it really has ceased to exist. There are lots of reporters who file to get these briefing notes, as we were talking about, but it might take a long time because there is no information released by default, and there is no incentive for public servants to release it because they might suffer some punishment if they make the department look bad, or there's no reward for releasing it, and there's no penalty for not releasing it. We have long thought that if you want to improve access to information, easy fix, have administrative monetary penalties for people who don't release information. It's a breach of an act of parliament. You get fined or fired or jailed for breaking other acts of parliament. Why not access to information? But, you know, governments in opposition for 20 years have been calling for reforms to access to information. And I'm not holding my breath to see any changes.
Because as soon as they get into government, they don't want to have that information released. Well, you know, I think it's absolutely fascinating that this information about Chinese interference in the elections actually came out, because, you know, that's not just a regular public servant. That's people in the securities the security system.
That took a whistleblower, and you know, we've had some of those too in some departments. But you know, whistleblowers take a lot of risk, try a lot of chances. And yes, that was a really big story for both Sam Cooper and Bob Fife, Steve Chase. Hats off to them. But every day there are little bits of things that are actually real stories too, if you care about how we're governed. And those things can't be ignored. We can't sit around and wait for the big kapow, or all we'll ever cover is cabinet shuffles.
Tell us if people want to check out even the outlines of the stories, what website they can go to.
So we are www.blacklocks.ca. We file 5 original stories every day, no press releases, no duplication of mainstream media, no question period. And you'll see a little, we call it a cut line, a little blurb that'll tell you the story. But if you click on it, I'm sorry, it's going to say members only and you have to pay, and it's $300 a year. Why? Oh my gosh, $300 a year. Although that's what my parents used to pay to have the newspaper delivered. We charge because we don't take subsidies. We think those are wrong. And we're opposed to C-18 subsidies too. So, you know, we believe that the model moving forward is going to be reader pay. And it'll evolve, and you won't be able to afford everybody, but maybe you'll pick the ones that, you know, suit you and the information you want. And we wish to be the niche federal affairs website in Ottawa. And I think we are.
Holly Doan, publisher of Blacklocks Publisher. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Great chatting.
Well, that's our show for tonight, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online from www.saga960am.ca. I think that, you know, what Holly's talking about is really key. And actually seeing some of these briefing notes, seeing the polls, seeing the documentary, the background documentary stuff is critically important. And I always pay attention to the Saturday newspapers. Maybe it's not as good as Blacklocks, but the Saturday newspapers, because what gets announced on Friday are the things that the government doesn't want you to know about. And so it's really good to actually hear about it. Holly Dole, thanks so much. That's our show for tonight. Good night, everybody.